The scorching sun blazed over the lively streets of Montgomery, Alabama. It was a typical morning, with the city's familiar hustle and bustle echoing through its busy sidewalks. At the heart of this vibrant city stood the Haven Trust Bank, its marble-clad halls gleaming under the sunlight. Inside, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards mixed with hushed conversations created an ambience of controlled efficiency. The morning rush was gradually subsiding as the employees began to ease into their regular routines, their professional demeanor masking the mundanity of the day. Through the tall, glass doors of the bank, a man entered with purposeful strides. He was tall, his sharp features accentuated by a meticulously tailored navy suit that exuded sophistication without being ostentatious. There was an air of quiet confidence about him, the kind that drew attention without demanding it. His name was Marcus Allen, a name that meant little to the people in the room at that moment, but would soon become unforgettable. Marcus approached the nearest customer service desk with a polite smile. "Good morning," he said, his tone warm yet composed. "I'd like to make a transaction." The clerk, a young woman with a pleasant demeanor, nodded and began typing on her computer. Before she could proceed, however, a sharp voice cut across the room. "I'll handle this," came the stern interjection. The voice belonged to Greg Benson, the branch manager. Greg was a man known for his rigid, authoritarian style of management. He wore his position as a badge of power, often relishing opportunities to assert his authority. His face, lined with years of self-imposed seriousness, carried a tight-lipped smile as he approached Marcus. It was the kind of smile that conveyed anything but friendliness. "Sir," Greg began, his tone carrying a subtle edge as he gave Marcus a scrutinizing look, "we have certain policies here. I'll need to see proper identification before proceeding." Marcus's expression remained calm as he reached into his pocket and handed over his ID. Greg took it, inspecting it for longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing in visible skepticism. "What is the purpose of your visit today?" Greg asked, his voice growing sharper as though Marcus's presence required extra scrutiny. "I'd like to withdraw from my account," Marcus replied, his voice steady and firm. Greg glanced at the ID once more before looking back at Marcus. "I'm sorry, but we can't process this without further verification. You understand, it's just policy." "Policy?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Or something else?" The room, once bustling with quiet activity, began to grow quieter. Employees and customers alike started to take notice, their stolen glances filled with curiosity and unease. Marcus, however, remained unfazed, standing tall and waiting silently for Greg to clarify. Greg cleared his throat, his voice growing louder, almost as if to compensate for the growing tension. "If you don't have additional verification, I suggest you return when you do." "I see," Marcus said evenly, his calm tone carrying a weight of meaning. "You're refusing to serve me, then?" "I didn't say that," Greg snapped, his face flushing slightly. "But we take fraud very seriously here, sir. I'm sure you understand." Marcus held Greg's gaze for a moment longer before giving a faint nod. "I do understand," he said, his voice calm but firm. "More than you realize." The room felt heavier now, the tension palpable. Marcus didn't raise his voice, nor did he appear flustered. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. With a few taps, he placed a call, his voice low but commanding. "Yes, this is Marcus," he said. "Could you send someone down to Haven Trust Bank? It seems there's been a misunderstanding." As he ended the call, Marcus turned back to Greg, whose expression shifted from confidence to confusion. "Let's wait a moment," Marcus said with a faint, enigmatic smile. The minutes that followed felt agonizingly long. Eyes darted nervously across the room, and whispers began to ripple among the employees and customers. Greg, now visibly uncomfortable, fidgeted behind the counter. "You can't expect special treatment, sir," Greg finally said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Rules are rules." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said calmly. "Just the same treatment as anyone else." The quiet assertion seemed to unsettle Greg further. "You people always think," he began, but caught himself mid-sentence, his face reddening as he realized what he was about to say. "You people?" Marcus repeated, his voice steady but cutting. Greg stammered, suddenly aware that others were listening. "I meant customers who don't follow proper procedures." By now, even the clerks behind their desks had stopped working, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. One of them, a young woman named Erin, whispered to her colleague, "Do you think he'll call the police?" The colleague shrugged nervously. Greg loves throwing his weight around, but this guy doesn't seem fazed. Meanwhile, Greg grabbed a clipboard, pretending to check documents, a futile attempt to look busy. "If you can't provide additional proof of your account, I'll have to ask you to leave," he said firmly. Marcus smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're quite confident in your judgment, Mr. Benson," he said. Greg bristled. "That's my job, ensuring this bank operates with integrity." "Integrity," Marcus repeated, the word heavy with irony. He turned slightly, addressing the room. "Is this how Haven Trust Bank defines integrity? By denying service based on assumptions?" Greg's face hardened. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave if you continue disrupting business." At that moment, the glass doors of the bank swung open with a soft hiss, and a tall man in a gray suit entered. His purposeful stride and commanding presence drew every eye in the room. "Mr. Allen," the newcomer said, addressing Marcus with deference. "I came as quickly as I could." The room fell silent as the man in the gray suit approached the counter where Marcus stood. His presence was magnetic, his stride purposeful, and his sharp eyes assessed the situation with a quick glance. Heads turned as whispers rippled through the bank, customers and employees alike sensing the shift in atmosphere. Greg blinked, his confusion evident as he looked between Marcus and the newcomer. "Mr. Allen?" Greg echoed, his voice unsteady. "Yes, Mr. Benson." The man in the gray suit replied curtly, turning to address Greg. "Marcus Allen, the principal owner of Haven Trust Bank." The words landed like a thunderclap. Greg's face drained of color, his clipboard slipping from his trembling hands and clattering onto the counter. The revelation sent a visible ripple through the room. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, customers murmured to one another, and even the clerks, who had remained frozen at their desks, leaned forward to catch every word. You own the bank?" Greg stammered, barely able to form the words. Marcus turned to him, his expression calm yet unyielding. "That's correct. And yet, here I am, being refused service by the very people entrusted to uphold the values of this institution." The tension in the room grew even heavier, the air thick with anticipation. Erin, the young clerk who had whispered earlier, covered her mouth in a futile attempt to suppress a gasp. Her colleague, who had dismissed the situation as just another confrontation, now looked as though he wanted to shrink into his seat. Greg opened his mouth, struggling to find the words to explain himself, but no sound came out. He resembled a man teetering on the edge of panic, desperately searching for an escape route that simply wasn't there. "You see, Mr. Benson," Marcus continued, his voice steady yet piercing, "I came here today to observe, to understand the experience of our customers firsthand. What I didn't expect was to witness a demonstration of bias and disrespect from someone in your position." The man in the gray suit cleared his throat, stepping forward cautiously. "Mr. Allen," he began, his tone measured, "would you like to discuss this matter in the boardroom, or shall we address it here?" Marcus glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of employees and customers who had been silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Their expressions ranged from embarrassment to awe, their attention unwavering. "No," Marcus said firmly, "we'll address it here. Everyone should hear this." Greg swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. Where Greg had once exuded authority, he now stood as a man stripped of his confidence, his earlier condescension replaced by visible anxiety. Marcus's voice broke the silence, carrying the weight of a calm storm. "Mr. Benson," he began, his tone measured but unrelenting. "As the manager of this branch, you represent the face of this bank to every person who walks through these doors. Your actions today tell me something troubling, not just about what this institution might stand for, but about what you stand for." Greg tried to recover, his voice a pale imitation of its former firmness. I assure you, sir, this was a misunderstanding. We have strict policies to prevent fraud, and I was only— Marcus raised a hand, silencing Greg instantly. This wasn't about fraud prevention, he said, his voice sharp and definitive. This was about your assumptions. You saw me walk in, decided I didn't belong, and acted accordingly. Let's not sugarcoat it. Greg's cheeks flushed a deep red, and he looked down at the counter as though it might offer him some form of reprieve. You didn't bother to ask questions, Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. You didn't look up my account details or take even a moment to understand the situation. Instead, you made a judgment based on nothing but what you thought you knew. And you were wrong. The weight of Marcus's words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. The staff stood frozen, their eyes darting nervously between Marcus and Greg. The customers whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting a mix of astonishment and quiet satisfaction at witnessing justice being served. Erin, standing near her desk, finally mustered the courage to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Allen, she said hesitantly, I just want to say that we're all here to support the bank's values. This isn't how we treat people. Marcus turned his gaze to her, his expression softening slightly. Thank you, he said. Your words matter, and I hope they reflect the integrity this institution should uphold. Greg, meanwhile, stood rooted to the spot, his earlier bravado reduced to silence. The clipboard he had pretended to busy himself with earlier now lay forgotten on the counter. The man in the gray suit stepped forward again, his professional demeanor betraying a hint of discomfort. Mr. Allen, he said carefully, shall we proceed with discussing the necessary actions? Or do you wish to take further steps now? Marcus's eyes remained on Greg, who looked as though he might crumble under the weight of the moment. Not yet, Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. There's still more that needs to be addressed. Right here, right now. The declaration sent another ripple through the room. Employees shifted uneasily, their gazes fixed on Marcus, who now stood as an unyielding figure of authority. Customers, many of whom had only come in for routine transactions, now found themselves unable to look away, drawn in by the gravity of the situation. As the silence stretched, Marcus took a step forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Integrity isn't just a word we put on banners or mention in mission statements, he said, his voice firm. It's something we demonstrate through our actions, every single day. He let the words sink in, his gaze sweeping over the room before finally settling back on Greg. And when those actions fall short, it's our responsibility to make things right. Greg's mouth opened slightly, but he seemed unable to respond. His earlier authority had been completely stripped away, leaving him standing as little more than a figure of misplaced arrogance. The silence in the room was heavy. Each second seemed to stretch out longer than the last, as though the entire bank had collectively held its breath. The tension was palpable, thick enough to make everyone in the vicinity aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A clash of ideologies, of authority and integrity, playing out right before their eyes. Marcus stood unmoving, his gaze unwavering. His calmness contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling around him, and it was clear that this was no accident. He had come prepared, not just to witness the behavior that had been unfolding before him, but to confront it head-on. Greg, still visibly shaken, seemed to be searching for an escape, his mind racing as he looked for some way to salvage the situation. But there was no easy out. He was backed into a corner, and the realization of that fact seemed to paralyze him further. Marcus took another deliberate step toward him, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. You know, Mr. Benson, he began, his words slow and measured. There's something fundamentally wrong when someone in your position treats a customer with such disrespect. It speaks volumes about the culture here, and not the one you might think you've been promoting. Greg's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and frustration evident in his expression. His hands trembled as they gripped the counter, the faintest traces of sweat forming on his forehead. The man in the gray suit, still standing by Marcus's side, shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the room as though anticipating a potential escalation. But Marcus's presence seemed to hold everything in check, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and reason. "I've entrusted this bank to represent the values I believe in," Marcus continued, his voice carrying a quiet but undeniable force. "But today, I'm forced to question what those values really are. And I don't just mean in the abstract. I mean in the everyday actions of the people running this institution. People like you, Mr. Benson." The words landed like a blow. Greg opened and closed his mouth, his tongue seemingly tied. He looked at Marcus, his mind struggling to formulate a defense, but finding nothing. The weight of the accusation was undeniable. Marcus let the silence hang in the air, his calm gaze never wavering. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He was not just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for the customers who had been unjustly scrutinized, for the employees who had remained silent, for the values that should have been upheld but had been compromised. "Do you know what it's like?" Marcus continued, his voice still calm but with a quiet intensity. "To walk into a place like this, expecting to be treated with the same respect as anyone else, only to have someone make judgments about you based on nothing but their own assumptions? How would that feel to you, Mr. Benson? How would you like to be on the receiving end of this kind of treatment?" Greg stood silent, his face flushed with a mix of guilt and indignation. His body language spoke volumes. Arms crossed, shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding contact with the customers and staff who were watching the scene unfold. Marcus did not let up. "I came here today to understand how our customers are treated. I didn't expect to experience this kind of bias and disrespect. And yet here I am, watching as you, a manager of this branch, seem more concerned with your assumptions than with upholding the very principles that should guide us." As Marcus spoke, the room grew heavier still. The customers who had been watching in silence now seemed to be leaning forward, hanging on to every word. They knew something important was happening, something that would not be forgotten. One of the younger employees, Erin, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "This isn't the kind of place I want to work in," she muttered softly, almost to herself. But the words were heard by those nearby, and a ripple of quiet agreement spread among the staff. Marcus turned to her, his expression softening. "I understand," he said, his voice genuine, "and it's people like you who will help shape this place into what it should be. It's not too late to make things right." Greg's eyes darted from Marcus to the others in the room, his mind desperately trying to find a way to restore some semblance of control. But it was clear that the situation was no longer in his hands. Marcus had taken the reins, and it was too late to back down. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," Greg tried to justify, his voice faltering. "I was just following procedure. We have strict policies." Marcus cut him off, his voice firm and commanding. "No, Mr. Benson, this wasn't about policies. It was about prejudice, about assumptions based on how someone looks, not who they are." The truth of Marcus's words seemed to hit harder with each passing second. Even the most hardened employees, those who had been loyal to the bank for years, couldn't deny it. The system they had worked under had allowed for this kind of behavior to flourish, unchecked. "Perhaps it's time to revisit what policy really means here," Marcus said, his words carrying the weight of experience and conviction. "Because, frankly, it's not enough to hide behind rules when they're being used to justify actions that are inherently wrong." The man in the gray suit, who had remained silently by Marcus's side until now, finally spoke up. "Mr. Allen, would you like me to have a formal investigation conducted regarding this incident?" Marcus turned to him, his gaze thoughtful for a moment. "No," he replied slowly. "I believe this situation speaks for itself. What we need now is action, not paperwork. We need to ensure that this doesn't happen again." Greg, by now, seemed to deflate. His earlier bluster had been completely stripped away, and all that was left was a man who had been exposed. He could no longer hide behind the pretense of authority or policy. The truth had been laid bare, and the shame of his actions was evident on his face. Marcus's gaze swept over the room once more. "This is a lesson for all of us," he said, his voice now carrying a note of finality. "We have to do better. We must do better. This bank stands for something, and it's time we all started living up to that." As Marcus spoke, he felt the weight of the moment settling over him. He knew that today, Things had changed, not just for Greg, but for everyone in that room. And though the road ahead might be difficult, it was a road that had to be traveled. The truth had been spoken, and it was impossible to ignore it any longer. With that, Marcus turned and walked toward the door, his confidence unwavering. The man in the gray suit followed closely behind, but the silence that had descended on the room remained. It was as though the bank had been transformed, its previous atmosphere of complacency replaced by the raw, undeniable power of change. And as the doors closed behind them, the employees and customers in that room were left with a powerful question to ponder. What kind of bank would they choose to be a part of from that moment on?